shopping mall buzzed with the hum of weekend shoppers, their laughter and chatter echoing off polished marble floors. Near the gleaming storefront of a luxury boutique, an older woman in a faded blue uniform knelt quietly, her worn hands gripping a mop, as she carefully cleaned a spill someone had left behind. Her movements were slow but deliberate, her face lined with years of hard work and silent endurance. She didn't look up when the sharp click of designer heels approached, didn't flinch when a shadow fell over her like a storm cloud. But then it happened. A hand flew through the air and struck her across the cheek with a crack that silenced the corridor. The older woman's head snapped to the side, her mop clattering to the floor as gasps rippled through the crowd. Standing above her was a younger woman draped in expensive silk and dripping with gold jewelry, her face twisted in disgust as she shouted that the cleaner had dirtied her $1,000 shoes. She called her filthy, useless, invisible, a nobody who should be grateful to even breathe the same air. The cleaner said nothing. She simply lowered her eyes, picked up her mop with trembling hands, and stepped aside, her dignity intact even as tears pooled silently in her eyes. The crowd whispered, some shook their heads, but no one intervened. Money, it seemed, had become a weapon, and cruelty, a currency. But what no one knew, not even the woman in silk, was that fate had already written the next chapter. In just a few days, she would walk into a billionaire's office for the opportunity of a lifetime, and standing there waiting with quiet eyes would be that same cleaner. Her name was Margaret, though most people never bothered to ask. To the world that rushed past her every day, she was simply the woman in the blue uniform, the one who mopped floors before the sun rose and emptied trash bins long after the stores had closed. Her hands were rough and calloused, her back bent from decades of labor, and her uniform had been washed so many times the fabric had thinned to near transparency in places. But beneath the weariness in the worn clothing lived a woman of unshakable strength, a woman who had raised a son alone after her husband died when the boy was only 7 years old. She had worked 3 jobs back then, cleaning office buildings at night, scrubbing dishes in restaurant kitchens during the afternoon, and taking in laundry on weekends. She never complained, never asked for pity, never let her son see her cry even when her feet bled inside her cheap shoes or when she went to bed hungry so he could have seconds at dinner. She taught him kindness, taught him that a person's worth was not measured in bank accounts or brand names, but in how they treated others when no one was watching. She told him that dignity was something no one could take from you unless you gave it away, and she lived that truth every single day. Now her son was grown and gone, living a life she had sacrificed everything to give him, and she continued her work in silence. Every morning she arrived at the mall before the first shoppers, pushing her cart of cleaning supplies through empty corridors that would soon fill with people who looked right through her. She wiped down railings that hundreds of hands would touch, scrubbed floors that thousands of feet would walk across, and emptied bins overflowing with the waste of those who had more than enough. She did her work with care, with pride, because she believed that all honest work deserved respect. Her co-workers admired her, the security guards greeted her by name, and the small cafe owners sometimes slipped her a free coffee and a pastry when business was slow. They saw her. They knew her heart. But to people like the woman in silk, people who measured human value in price tags and social status, Margaret was invisible. She was less than furniture, less than air, and that perhaps was the cruelest humiliation of all, to exist in a world that refused to see you as fully human. Margaret's story began not in poverty, but in love. She had been young once, barely 22, with bright eyes and dreams that stretched beyond the horizon. She had married a kind man, a factory worker named Thomas, who promised her a simple but happy life. When their son was born, she thought her world was complete. They lived in a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and a leaking roof, but it was filled with laughter and warmth. Thomas would come home tired and covered in grease, but he always had energy to lift their baby boy high in the air and make him giggle. Margaret stayed home those first years, singing lullabies and stitching torn clothes by lamplight, believing that love could shield them from the harshness waiting outside their door. But fate is cruel to those who have little to bargain with. When her son turned 7, Thomas collapsed at the factory. A heart attack, the doctor said, sudden and merciless. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. Margaret became a widow overnight, and with that single moment, her entire world shattered into pieces she would spend the rest of her life trying to hold together. There was no life insurance, no savings, no family wealth to fall back on. There was only a grieving woman, a confused child, and a mountain of bills that grew taller each week. She had no education beyond high school, no special skills that employers valued, so she took the only jobs available to someone like her, the jobs no one else wanted. She cleaned office toilets at 3 in the morning, her knees aching on cold tile floors. She washed dishes in restaurant kitchens until her hands cracked and bled from the harsh detergents. She took in laundry from neighbors, scrubbing stains by hand because she couldn't afford a washing machine, hanging clothes on lines stretched across their cramped apartment. There were nights when she fed her son rice and beans and told him she had already eaten, when in truth her stomach twisted with hunger. There were winters when she wore 3 sweaters under her coat because they couldn't afford to run the heater. There were moments when she sat alone in the dark after her son fell asleep and allowed herself to weep silently, her face buried in her hands, wondering how much longer she could keep going. But every morning she woke up and kept going anyway. She never let her son see her despair. Instead, she taught him lessons that no school could provide. She taught him that kindness costs nothing but means everything, that a person who looks down on others reveals only their own smallness, that true wealth is measured in character and compassion, not in possessions. She showed him that honest work, no matter how humble, deserves respect, and that the hands that clean, that build, that serve are the hands that hold society together. She told him stories at night about heroes who weren't born in castles, but in ordinary homes, who became great not through inheritance, but through courage and integrity. She raised him to see people, truly see them, regardless of what they wore or where they worked. And when he graduated high school with honors, earned a scholarship to university, and later built a business empire that made him a billionaire, she knew that every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of hunger and pain had been worth it. But she never asked him for anything in return. She continued her work, continued her quiet life, because dignity and independence were values she refused to surrender, even to her own beloved son. His name was Daniel Carter, and if you search that name online, you would find articles in Forbes and Business Insider, photographs of a sharp-suited man shaking hands with world leaders and tech innovators, headlines announcing billion-dollar deals and philanthropic initiatives that changed entire communities. He was the founder and CEO of Carter Industries, a global empire spanning technology, real estate, and sustainable energy. At 35, he had accomplished what most people couldn't achieve in 3 lifetimes. His office occupied the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper that pierced the clouds. His signature appeared on contracts worth hundreds of millions, and his name carried weight in boardrooms across continents. But those who worked closest to him knew something the magazines never captured. They knew that Daniel Carter arrived at the office before his employees and stayed later than his executives, that he remembered the names of the janitors and security guards, that he once stopped a board meeting to help a young intern who had spilled coffee and was trembling with embarrassment. They knew he donated anonymously to schools in poor neighborhoods, that he established scholarship funds for children of single parents, that he built affordable housing projects when other developers only chased luxury profits. He never flaunted his wealth, never spoke down to those who had less, never forgot where he came from or who had brought him there. Every decision he made, every value he held, every ounce of his integrity traced back to one source, to the woman who had raised him in that cramped apartment, who had gone hungry so he could eat, who had taught him that a person's worth had nothing to do with their bank account and everything to do with their character. He loved his mother with a fierceness that surprised those who only knew his cool professional demeanor. He called her every single day, tried to visit her every week despite his impossible schedule, and begged her repeatedly to stop working and let him take care of her. But Margaret refused. She told him she was proud of him, but that she had built her own life with her own hands, and she wouldn't trade her independence for comfort. So Daniel respected her wishes. even though it hurt him to know she still scrubbed floors and emptied trash bins. He respected her because she had taught him that love sometimes means honoring someone's choices even when you wish they would choose differently. And though the world saw him as a powerful billionaire, he saw himself as simply her son, forever grateful, forever devoted, forever shaped by her sacrifice. Her name was Victoria Ashford, and she wore her ambition like the designer perfume that announced her arrival before she entered a room. At 32, she had built her identity entirely around appearances, around being seen in the right places with the right people, around collecting luxury items and influential connections like trophies on a shelf. She came from money, not extraordinary wealth, but enough to give her a taste of privilege that made her hunger for more. Her father owned a moderately successful import business. Her mother hosted charity luncheons where women compared jewelry and vacation destinations. And Victoria had learned early that in their world, perception was everything and compassion was weakness. She had perfected the art of social climbing, knowing exactly when to laugh at a powerful man's joke, when to compliment another woman's outfit while subtly implying her own was better, when to drop names and brand labels into conversation like breadcrumbs leading to her supposed importance. Her Instagram feed was a carefully curated museum of her life, each photo filtered and posed to project success, beauty, and enviable status. She spoke about charity work she never actually did, claimed friendships with celebrities she had only met briefly at events, and treated service workers as if they were part of the furniture, invisible unless they made a mistake that inconvenienced her. To Victoria, the world was divided into two categories, people who mattered and people who didn't, and the only measure that determined which category you fell into was money and social position. She could be charming when it benefited her, pouring on sweetness and false warmth when meeting someone who could advance her agenda. But the moment someone had nothing to offer her, the mask dropped and revealed the cold calculation underneath. She saw relationships as transactions, saw kindness as something you performed only when witnesses were watching, saw people in service positions as fundamentally less human than herself. And now she had set her sights on the ultimate prize, Daniel Carter, the billionaire whose wealth and influence could launch her into the stratosphere of society she desperately craved to inhabit. She had researched him obsessively, learned his business interests, memorized details about his public appearances, and secured a meeting with his company under the pretense of a business partnership proposal. But really, she was hunting. She wanted to become Mrs. Daniel Carter, to stand beside him at galas and press conferences, to transform herself from merely wealthy adjacent into genuinely powerful. She had no idea that the woman she had humiliated in the mall, the woman whose face she had slapped, and whose dignity she had tried to crush beneath her expensive heel, was the one person in the world whose opinion mattered most to the man she intended to conquer. The executive suite of Carter Industries existed in a realm most people only saw in movies. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a living painting, sunlight pouring across Italian marble floors and reflecting off surfaces of polished chrome and dark wood. Modern art worth small fortunes hung on walls the color of winter clouds, and the furniture spoke of craftsmanship that cost more than most people earned in years. The receptionist, elegant and professional, had greeted Victoria with practiced courtesy and offered her sparkling water in crystal glasses while she waited. Victoria sat with her spine straight and her legs crossed at the ankle, exactly as her mother had taught her, projecting confidence and sophistication. She had dressed meticulously for this meeting, a cream-colored designer suit that had cost $4,000, heels that added 3 inches to her height and made her legs look endless, jewelry expensive enough to impress but subtle enough to suggest she didn't need to try too hard. Her hair fell in perfect waves, her makeup highlighted her features without appearing obvious, and she had rehearsed her smile in the mirror that morning until it looked both warm and mysteriously alluring. This was her moment, the meeting she had maneuvered for months to secure, and she intended to dazzle Daniel Carter so completely that he would see her not as a potential business partner, but as someone who belonged in his world, beside him, sharing his empire and his name. When the office door finally opened and she was invited inside, Victoria rose with fluid grace and walked forward with the confidence of someone who believed the universe owed her everything she desired. Daniel Carter stood near the windows, silhouetted against the bright sky, his presence commanding, even in stillness. But Victoria's attention fractured the moment she noticed someone else in the room. Near a small sitting area, arranging fresh flowers in a simple vase, was a woman in a faded blue cleaning uniform. Victoria's step faltered. Her practiced smile froze on her face. Ice water flooded her veins as recognition slammed into her chest like a physical blow. It was her, the cleaner from the mall, the woman she had slapped, screamed at, humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses. What was she doing here? Was she cleaning the billionaire's office? Had she somehow followed Victoria? The older woman looked up slowly, and their eyes met across the expensive space. There was no anger in Margaret's gaze, no smugness or desire for revenge. Only a quiet sadness that somehow felt worse than hatred. Victoria's mouth went dry. Her carefully prepared opening lines evaporated from her mind. Fear crawled up her spine as she realized this woman could destroy her right now with a single sentence. Could tell Daniel Carter exactly what kind of person Victoria really was beneath the designer clothes and practiced charm. She opened her mouth, though no sound emerged, her brain frantically calculating how to explain, how to spin this, how to salvage a situation that was collapsing around her like a building with its foundation removed. And then Daniel Carter spoke, his voice calm and clear in the terrible silence. He walked toward the older woman and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his expression softening with unmistakable love and respect. "Miss Ashford," he said, turning to face Victoria with eyes that suddenly seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade, "I'd like you to meet someone very important. This is my mother." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Victoria felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, felt her lungs forget how to pull in oxygen, felt every calculation and ambition and carefully laid plan crumble into dust. The woman she had treated as less than human, the woman whose face she had struck without a second thought, was the mother of the man she had come here to seduce and use. And from the way Daniel Carter was looking at her now, with dawning understanding replacing his initial professional courtesy, Victoria knew that her humiliation was only beginning. The silence stretched like broken glass, sharp and dangerous. Victoria's face drained of color, her hands trembling, despite her desperate attempt to maintain composure. She tried to speak, tried to summon the charm that had always been her weapon, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't realize." But Daniel's expression had transformed completely. The polite professionalism had vanished, replaced by something cold and terrible. His jaw tightened as he looked between Victoria and his mother, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "Didn't realize what?" he asked quietly, and the quietness was more frightening than shouting. "That she was a person? That she deserved basic human respect?" Margaret touched her son's arm gently, her voice soft. "Daniel, it's all right. It doesn't matter." But it did matter. It mattered more than anything. Daniel turned to Victoria and she felt pinned beneath his gaze like an insect under glass. "What did you do to her?" Victoria's carefully constructed world was imploding. She could feel everything slipping away, the future she had imagined, the status she had craved, the empire she had planned to infiltrate. Tears sprang to her eyes, though whether from genuine remorse or fear of losing her opportunity, even she couldn't say. "It was a mistake," she stammered. "I was having a terrible day, and there was a spill, and my shoes. They were expensive, and I lost my temper for a moment. You slapped her." Margaret's voice was quiet, but clear. Not accusatory, simply stating fact. "In front of dozens of people. You called me filthy. You called me useless. You said I was lucky to breathe the same air as you." The words landed like hammer blows. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides, his entire body rigid with barely controlled fury. He had spent his entire life watching his mother sacrifice, watching her endure disrespect and invisibility, watching the world treat her as disposable simply because she was poor. And here stood a woman who embodied everything he despised, everything his mother had taught him never to become, someone who measured human worth in dollars and judged dignity by designer labels. "Get out," he said, his voice low and absolute. Victoria's tears spilled over. Please, Mr. Carter, if you would just let me explain. I made a mistake. I'm so sorry. Please. You're sorry you got caught, Daniel said, cutting through her pleading like a knife. You're sorry that your cruelty has consequences. You're not sorry for what you did to her, for how you made her feel, for treating her like she was nothing. He stepped closer, and Victoria instinctively backed away. My mother taught me that you can know everything about a person's character by watching how they treat people who can do nothing for them. You showed me exactly who you are, and people like you have no place in my business or my life. Victoria stood frozen, mascara running down her cheeks, her expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume, her carefully practiced confidence shattered beyond repair. The truth had been exposed, and there was no charm sophisticated enough, no lie polished enough to cover what she truly was underneath. Daniel walked to his desk and pressed the intercom button, his voice steady and final. Security, please escort Miss Ashford from the building. She is no longer welcome here, and her name should be added to the restricted list. Victoria's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Please, she whispered one last time, desperation cracking through every syllable. I need this opportunity. I've worked so hard to get here. Daniel looked at her with something that might have been pity if it weren't mixed with such disappointment. You worked hard to get here through manipulation and calculation, not through merit or integrity. The business proposal you submitted will be declined. Any future communications from you or your family's company will be returned unopened. This meeting is over. The security guards appeared in the doorway, professional and silent. Victoria looked once more at Margaret, perhaps hoping for mercy, for intervention, for the kindness she herself had never shown. But Margaret simply stood there with quiet dignity, her hands folded in front of her, her expression neither triumphant nor vindictive. She had not asked for this confrontation, had not sought revenge or justice. She had simply existed as herself, and the truth had done the rest. As Victoria was led away, her heels clicking frantically against the marble floor, her sobs echoing down the hallway, Margaret finally spoke. You didn't have to be so harsh with her, Daniel. She's young. She might learn. Daniel turned to his mother and his expression softened immediately, the anger draining away to reveal only love and old pain. Maybe she will, but that lesson won't come from being rewarded with opportunities after treating people like you the way she did. Consequences teach what words cannot. Margaret nodded slowly, understanding even if part of her still carried compassion for everyone, even those who had hurt her. She had not wanted revenge. She had never wanted anyone to suffer. But justice, she understood, was not the same as revenge. Justice was simply truth being allowed to speak. The office felt different after Victoria left, as though a storm had passed and left the air cleaner in its wake. Daniel guided his mother to the comfortable leather sofa near the windows, the same sofa where he made his most important decisions, and sat beside her with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who only knew his boardroom reputation. For a long moment they simply sat together in silence, watching the city spread out below them like a living tapestry of light and shadow, of movement and stillness. Margaret reached over and took her son's hand, her rough, calloused fingers wrapping around his smooth ones, and he held on as if anchoring himself to the one constant truth in his complicated world. I'm proud of you, she said softly, and those simple words carried more weight than any contract he had ever signed. Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. I should have been there, at the mall. I should have protected you from people like her. Margaret shook her head gently, a small smile touching her tired face. You've been protecting me your whole life, even when you were too small to reach the kitchen counter. You don't need to fight every battle for me. I'm stronger than I look. He knew she was. He had always known. His strength, his resilience, his unwillingness to break under pressure, all of it came from her. She was the foundation upon which his entire empire had been built. Not through money or connections, but through the values she had instilled in him when they had nothing but each other. Will you finally consider retiring? He asked, though he already knew her answer. Let me take care of you the way you took care of me. Margaret laughed softly, the sound like wind chimes on a quiet evening. And what would I do with myself? Sit in a big empty house and watch television all day? I like my work, Daniel. It gives me purpose. It keeps me connected to real people, to real life. Your world up here is beautiful, but it's not mine. He wanted to argue, wanted to insist, but he understood. Dignity meant different things to different people, and for his mother it meant maintaining her independence, her routine, her identity that existed separate from his success. So instead, he simply held her hand tighter and made her promise to at least reduce her hours, to let him hire someone to help with the heavy lifting, to accept the small comforts he could provide without taking away her autonomy. 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Daniel arrived at his office to find a young woman waiting nervously in the reception area. She was plainly dressed, holding a worn folder against her chest, her resume printed on cheap paper. His assistant explained that she had no appointment, no connections, just a request for 5 minutes of his time to discuss an entry-level position in the company's community outreach program. Most CEOs would have had her redirected to human resources, would never have interrupted their schedule for someone so far below their level. But Daniel remembered every lesson his mother had taught him. He remembered that everyone deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with dignity, regardless of where they start in life. So he invited her in, offered her a seat, and listened to her story with the same attention he would give to any board member or investor. Because that was what his mother had taught him. That was the man she had raised him to be. And as sunlight streamed through the windows of his office high above the city, Daniel Carter understood that true wealth had nothing to do with the numbers in his bank accounts, and everything to do with the values in his heart. Values that no amount of money could buy and no amount of cruelty could destroy. The story carries a truth that echoes far beyond the walls of that billionaire's office. A truth that lives in every interaction we have, every judgment we make, every moment we choose between cruelty and compassion. Victoria Ashford had everything the world told her mattered. Beauty, wealth, status, designer clothes, and expensive tastes. Yet she had nothing that actually made a person worth knowing. She measured human value in price tags and bank balances, never understanding that the numbers in your account say nothing about the content of your character. Margaret, on the other hand, owned almost nothing by the world's standards. Yet she possessed everything that truly matters: dignity, integrity, kindness, and the kind of strength that comes only from surviving storms that would have broken lesser souls. She raised a billionaire not by giving him money, but by teaching him values. And those values became the foundation of an empire built not just on profit, but on principle. The lesson here cuts deep and demands our attention. You never know who someone really is based on their appearance, their job, or their current circumstances. The person you dismiss today might be someone extraordinarily important tomorrow. But more than that, every person deserves respect simply because they are human, not because of what they might become or what they can do for you. Kindness is not a strategy or a transaction. It is the baseline of decent humanity. Treat the cleaner with the same respect you show the CEO, because character is revealed not in how you treat your equals, but in how you treat those who can do nothing for you. Before you judge someone by their worn uniform or calloused hands, remember that you have no idea what battles they have fought, what sacrifices they have made, or whose life they have shaped with quiet courage. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about how you treat others, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters in this world. Because sometimes we all need to be reminded that wealth fades, beauty ages, and status changes. But character, the content of your soul, that is forever.